Most likely will go on next quarter.
Yes, ma'am.
To start off second quarter. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Murphy. It's all you.
All right, so everyone take out a quick piece of paper really quick. We're going to start just a quick writing exercise. You do have to do it. Everybody has to do it. All right, so I'm going to give you guys 60 seconds to write down on a sheet of paper what you guys think a landmark case is. After that 60 seconds,
Mine's gonna
take it. After that 60 seconds, you're going to share with a partner, and then we're going to move on. So you got 60 seconds starting now. It's okay if you don't know. Make a guess.
I'm looking for one. I think you can find one.
Okay, I don't know what happened. Where's the bottom left hand? And then check the 1A as well.
What up, you don't know what it is?
By the way, I like
Yes.
the bridges. My what? My pants? Thank you.
You got 20 seconds.
Cinco, I heard cinco.
All right, turn to the person across from you or the person next to you and share what you think the definition of a landmark case is, and they will share their definition as well. You got 60 seconds to do that. Go ahead.
Oh, a landmark.
And we do landmark.
Oh, that's all we do. Okay, so
It would be.
well, we don't know what it is, so then we're just guessing.
You got 30 more seconds.
Yeah, that's what I was trying.
I gotta get a big haircut. Is it up on the roof? And we're just gonna go for Just guess it.
All right, so in 3, 2, 1. Today we're going to be talking about landmark Supreme Court cases. And for now, yeah. So, some terms to know. Who's got Post-it note 1? You're going to read that first definition up there. Nice and loud.
Oh, I can't see.
Can I write that? Take notes on whatever you guys think you need to take notes on. If you take better notes, that will help you with your project that you're doing later today. So,
Really?
it says landmark decision, yep.
Landmark decision establishing a new legal principle or concept or substantially changing existing law and interpretation.
So a landmark case is based around what is called a landmark decision, and basically that says that we are changing a law substantially and the interpretation of that law, or that we are creating a new law based on what's been happening in U.S. society. Who's got Post-it note number 2?
Judicial review process.
Grading any of our classes stuff. Are you grading any of our classes stuff? Just because.
So you guys heard that term in this class before. We talked about it a little bit when we were going over the Constitution. The judicial review allows the Supreme Court of the United States to decide whether or not actions by the President and Congress hold up against the Constitution to make sure that they're not doing anything illegal. So that's the process of judicial review. We'll get a little bit more into that in just a second. Who's got number 3?
I do, but I can't see that.
So move closer.
Number 3?
Yep. Separate but equal.
Races, right?
so for everybody, just make sure you guys all heard it. It's a U.S. legal doctrine. Racial segregation does not violate the 14th Amendment. Who can tell me what the 14th Amendment is about?
Everyone has rights to vote.
Everyone has the right to vote. It's close.
Yes.
Okay.
Right there. Right here.
Equal rights.
Okay. Equal rights. Okay, so the race is close.
It's U.S. citizen rights.
Exactly. So it is rights. Excuse me. It establishes who has citizenship within the United States. So if you were born here or if you were naturalized, then you are granted the rights of a citizen. The 14th Amendment also says that they cannot take away the rights of citizens in any way. So separate but equal, it was the argument that we can segregate education based on race because they're still getting the same equal education, even though they are separated from students of color. So who's got number 4?
Miranda writes legal reminders that criminal suspects have the right to silence and an attorney.
So who's seen a cop show that they do their Miranda rights? You got the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney, anything you say can and will be held against you in a court of law. Is that all familiar to everybody? Who has not heard that? Anyone? Y'all need to watch some more like NCIS or something. Who's got number 5?
I do.
Alright. Nice and loud.
Freedom of speech, the right to express opinion without censorship or restraint.
Yep. So freedom of speech, you have the right to say what you want without censorship or restraint. There are a few exceptions to that, like hate speech, and you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. That's obviously going to create a problem. But where does the right to free speech come from in the U.S.?
Protest.
So it's not a protest. Protest is a form of free speech, but the First Amendment, good. So the First Amendment, as part of the Bill of Rights, is the right to free speech. Slide one. So the first landmark case we're actually going to talk about is Marbury versus Madison, and it was decided in 1803. This is what established the long-term impact of judicial review. The presidential race immediately preceding or that came before this case was very, very contentious and very hotly debated and contested. So much so that the most recent presidential election has been compared to this case for how nasty it was. So the previous administration appointed a bunch of judges, and then at sort of the last hour, he wanted to have all these judges appointed and have them given their legal documentation to do that. Because it was like 11 o'clock at night, and this is 1800, they didn't have email to say, hey, here's your appointment, go forth and have fun. So they had to do it all by horseback or carriage or what have you. So a lot of these judges didn't get their actual documentation, and one of them, William Marbury, took the new Secretary of State, James Madison, who would eventually become president. He took him to court and said, I want my judgeship, you have to give it to me. Madison disagreed and just refused to give it to him. So it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and once it got there, the case that Mr. Marbury made was that based on the Judiciary Act of 1789, he should have access to his federal appointment of a judgeship. And the court, in sort of a counterintuitive move, said, you know what, this Judiciary Act is against the Constitution, so it's not constitutional, and we are not going to issue your documentation. So initially, they limited themselves in their power, according to Article 3 of the Constitution. Excuse me. Although in the long term, this is what sets up judicial review, as I said, and that allowed the Supreme Court to be sort of the powerhouse in the U.S. government that it would become. Next slide.
No, go back.
Okay. You don't have to write down everything, just summarize stuff. We don't have a whole lot of time this morning, so you have to write quickly. I don't have a whole lot of time.
Do a project today.
Is it just regular data?
You're going to be working on a big project. All right, so the next one that's really important that we're going to talk about is Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. That basically said that the whole separate but equal argument, keep it down everybody, the whole separate but equal argument wasn't constitutional because they weren't getting an equal education. So the argument that established separate but equal was a different landmark case that you guys can research on your own as part of your project if you want. That was Plessy v. Ferguson. Some have said that Brown versus Board of Education was the early beginning of the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, the Black Panther Party, Malcolm X. We'll probably get into more of that a little later on. Excuse me. But this law and this landmark case only made segregation in education illegal. So what are some other areas that you guys may be familiar with that segregation would have still been legal? So that means separation based on race, whether you were white or black. Work, good. Work was one.
Transportation.
Transportation, right? So what do you mean by that?
Like bus ride.
Right, so there was the colored section of the bus and the white section of the bus. Yeah.
Areas of the city.
Areas of the city, yeah. That goes back to something called redlining, and certain parts of cities had red lines drawn on the map, and black people just couldn't move beyond that line. They weren't allowed to buy a home or buy property. It's good. Next. So the next one is Miranda versus Arizona in 1966. That establishes the Miranda rights that we talked about, the right to an attorney, the right to remain silent. And it was based on when Ernesto Miranda was arrested and he confessed to a crime while under police interrogation when he wasn't read his constitutional rights of the right to an attorney, the right to remain silent, the right to be questioned in an attorney's presence. So now the Miranda case mandates that suspects be read and informed of their rights when they are arrested. And it is so important to the Constitution and to people's civil rights that if the suspect doesn't speak English, is deaf, is blind, or any other situation that, quote, traditional English reading of the Miranda rights are not available, a police force has to find some way to inform the suspect of their rights in some fashion. So that's an interpreter, that's Braille. You guys are familiar with that. That's the dots that you see on elevators and stuff.
How you gonna get someone blind like that?
Are you what?
How about you?
So you can see this creates a lot of potential headache for police jurisdiction, but we care a lot about civil rights in this country. So we try and make sure that everyone has an equal shot. He was, Mr. Miranda, later tried and convicted of the crimes that he did commit. So it's not necessarily that he wasn't guilty to begin with, but he wasn't read his rights. So that case was thrown out. He was tried again, and then he was eventually in prison. So the last one we're going to talk about in a little bit of depth is called Tinker versus Des Moines, and it's the Des Moines Independent School District in Iowa. That was decided in 1969. Based on the picture of the young man and young woman up there, what do you guys think this one might relate to?
Gucci.
White people?
Gender equality.
Gender? It's close. What do you guys think was happening in 1969?
Peace.
The Vietnam War, exactly. So, this was the height of the Vietnam War, and people your age and people my age all over the country were pretty upset about what was going on because tens of thousands of people were being killed in Vietnam for what was seen as sort of a pointless exercise in militarism. So the Tinker siblings, or that young man and young woman up there with the peace armbands, and they wore those armbands to school one day, and they were suspended because they were causing a disturbance, according to the school district administration. They took this all the way to the Supreme Court and said that they have a right to free speech while in school, and that suspension was impinging or removing their rights to free speech. So even though they were suspended, eventually they took it all the way to the Supreme Court, like I said, and they did win, and their suspensions were removed. I think it's kind of a hilarious irony, though, because how much time do you think they missed in school taking their case to the Supreme Court instead of just, like the 2-day suspensions? But I understand their principle, and I absolutely respect that.
They should have given the credit as well.
That's what I was wondering too, because the courts can take up to like 3 months at a time.
Courts can take up to years to decide a decision. So, they might have been like 26 by the time their suspension from high school got revoked. I don't know.
Degree and student for the degree.
All right, so for the next 2 or 3 minutes, probably 3, I want you guys to take out a separate sheet of paper, or you guys can do it on the same one that you've been taking your notes on. You're not actually going to be turning this in, you're going to be using it for your project. I want you guys to think about the Tinker versus Des Moines case, and I want you to write about a free speech issue that should or should not be, in your own opinion, allowed on school campuses. So some possible examples that I've listed up there on the right. Who can tell me, or who can give me a quick summary of the kneeling during the national anthem protests that are going on right now? Keep it down, keep it down. One at a time. What do I mean? So like, who's familiar with kneeling during the national anthem protests? Alright, give me a quick summary of what they're doing.
Me?
Yep,
Out loud.
out loud.
What's good?
I don't know.
Okay,
Yeah.
they kneel during the national anthem.
Okay, why?
Because,
Black.
Trump. Not Trump, it's,
Because Black Lives Matter.
It's related to Black Lives Matter. And so what do Black Lives Matter, what are they arguing?
I passed it to my homie that
About cops shooting black people.
About cops shooting black people, racial injustice, continued legal racial segregation, things like that. Who, white supremacists, good. So that actually is related to the very last one, the alt-right movement. Who's familiar with that? That can sort of give me a quick summary. Anyone? This one's a little more abstract and a lot more recent. It's related to white supremacy. Alright, so the alt-right is the protests that took place in Charlottesville just a couple months ago. There was one in Florida where the governor of Florida declared a state of emergency because he was so concerned with safety and security in the state. Because a guy by the name of Jesse Spencer was set to give a presentation or a speech at, I think, the University of Florida? One of those?
Florida.
But basically, alt-right movements are pro-white supremacy, pro-white nationalism, and fairly anti anybody not white, or sort of the traditional societal norm. So, just take a quick 2 minutes to write down your opinion of what should or should not be allowed in schools based on free speech. You can also include things like, one I heard recently was like a rainbow armband being worn to school.
Oh,
You say
that's
whether-
just messed up.
what?
Okay, so write about it if you want to.
So I'm writing about one of the.
Okay, that's fine. Alright, so you got 2 minutes. You guys want, a good way to structure it is something like, in my opinion, I believe blank, whatever is at issue, should or should not be allowed in school because 2 or 3 reasons.
Oh, but it's like, I know where's my religion. Is that free speech? Like, like back to my keep going. Like, I don't know. That's the thing. That's the only thing I heard. Nothing else. I don't know. It's this one.
Alright, you got 60 more seconds.
You don't have to sign that one. It's
Alright, you got 20 seconds. Alright, so 3, 2, 1. Alright, thank you guys for doing that. Appreciate it, for staying attentive. Ms. Hirsch is going to go over the rubric for your guys' landmark case assignment in your project, and you're going to be working on that for the rest of the day. No, because I want you to use your notes with that for the project. Really quick. For the project, these are some ideas that you guys can use as well if you want to pick one of those cases.
Alright, hey, are we working on the
Awesome. Can you guys tell me so quickly? Thank you.
You can Google landmark
I know,
cases and it's got
because
all those
I'll
out
have that available.
Show
You're
that
okay. All right.
Okay, I was gonna be like, no.
Yeah, trust me. This isn't my first rodeo. Okay, listen. Shh. I have a rubric for you. We're gonna go through it quickly. You don't have much time, so you really can't be dorking off like I told you.